And hello YouTube, this is Thomas Judge back once again with another installment of my DC Rebirth reading guide series. Today is video 5.2, which is the second and final video in the section which is the New Age of DC Heroes, section 5 of this 10-part guide. As a quick intro to where this fits in, please remember I've read the entirety of DC Rebirth, that's 3,370 issues, and I've been releasing a guide for this era bit by bit. What you can see here is the playlists on my channel. So there's one playlist that covers every single DC Rebirth and Rebirth related video I have ever and will ever do. But that's actually composed of the contents which I've split into 3 separate playlists as well, just for your ease of use. One of which covers all my custom binds and custom comics from the DC Rebirth era, and I've obviously shown you a few of those already. The next one is to show you the DC Rebirth guides that I've done for the sections that aren't the core continuity, so things like Deceased and Black Label and licensed comics and out of continuity and that sort of thing. And then the third, and what will eventually be the largest playlist within this section, is the DC Rebirth core continuity, which is all the comics of the core DC Rebirth and mainstream universe. So the stuff that you would have heard about, like Death Metal and Dark Knights and all that sort of stuff, that's all here. I would remind you before you watch this video, which is part of that core playlist, you should really go back and watch the introduction for the whole series, video 0.0, because it provides a lot of scene setting, a lot of context, and it also explains a few key concepts, like volumes with a big and small V, and type P and J readers, which I'm not going to explain every time, so please do go back and watch one of my intro videos for this, or any of my other reading guides. I'm going to show you the map in a second, but let's just remember this section 5 is for the New Age of DC Heroes, which are these heroes you can see here on this DC advert, which all launched after Dark Knight's Metal. It's part of what they call New Age of DC Heroes, but some people called it the Dark Matter line. It was a bit of a publishing sub-imprint within DC Rebirth and the DC Rebirth universe, but I guess the most important thing is that it's largely very, very self-contained, and it was pretty much a commercial failure. So that's why I've got it here in a self-contained section. With no further ado, let's dive into the map. And here we are back at the map. So this is the strategic map for section 5 of my reading guide. As we discussed before, and as I've just mentioned, essentially what this map is for the New Age of DC Heroes. It starts off just after Dark Knight's Metal, and then these are all the lines that I include in it, and then obviously we have Future State as the final event for DC Rebirth. In the last video in this series, we covered the first 5, so we covered from Batman and the Signal all the way down and up to including new challenges. And now today we're going to finish it off by talking about these last 4 series. So just looking at it structurally, schematically, and with a top level overview, we're going to be talking about Sideways, Silencer, Terrifics, and the Unexpected, all of which start after Dark Knight's Metal and then all end at varying points given the length of those series. Terrifics is a bit of an anomaly, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So let's scroll down to the trade paperback level, and with that we're going to be looking at Sideways. So with Sideways, what can I say about this? It was written by Dan Didio and Justin Jordan. It was drawn by Ken Rocafort. I'm a huge fan of his artwork, and the storyline is basically about a guy called Derek James who gains the ability to travel from one dimension to the other. The first volume, as you can see here, and as you can see the branding there, New Age of DC Heroes, that's Sideways volume 1, that's volume with a small v1, called Steppin' Out, without a G because it's cool. It contains issues 1 to 6. A couple of things worth mentioning here, or worth noting. So to start off with, even from issue 1, this features the character of Tempus Fuggernaut, who you will recall from the Dark Knight's Metal event and the map that I did in section 3 of this reading guide. And essentially, he's the character that narrates the Tales of the Dark Multiverse stories. So he's like a major side character across all of Sideways. As well as that, issue 3 here does reference the Flash Lightning Strikes Twice arc, but you'll be fine without reading that. Over here you have volume 2, there's a volume with a small v, it's called Rifts and Revelations. It contains issues 7 to 13 and annual 1. To put that in sequence properly, it's issues 7 to 9, which feature a whole bunch of random mystical magical people. Zatanna, Frankenstein, Clarion the Witch Boy. It's a whole load of random magical stuff. It's quite annoying. I don't like it, me personally. And it then climaxes in annual 1, which features Superman. And then after that, you then have issues 10 to 13, which, to be honest, kind of meanders for a bit and then closes up the story. Overall, this is tied into the Dark Knight's Metal event because the Dark Knight's Metal event is where Derek gets his superpowers from. And it does feature Tempest Fugonaut, like I say, the narrator of the Tales from the Dark Multiverse series. But basically, this is kind of a failed plot series, really, more than anything else. Next up, we're looking here at the Silencer. So this is, let me just zoom in a little bit. There we are. So what we have here is Silencer, which is from 2018 to 2019. You can see 3 trade paperbacks here. It's written by Dan Abnett, who's an amazing writer, and it's got art which was originally by John Romita Jr., whether you like that or not, but then cycles through a bunch of other artists, like I think Victor Bogdanovich, Patrick Zirka, Tom Derenick, and V. Ken Marion. So the storyline here is about a whole brand new character we've never seen before, like all of these series tend to be. And the main character is a person you can see in the cover here, who's actually called Honor Guest. So Honor is her first name, Guest is her last name. And Honor is a retired assassin who ends up getting targeted by her former employer. Plot twist, her former employer is Leviathan, which in this context is the criminal network run by Talia al Ghul, daughter of Ra's al Ghul, mother of Damian Wayne. So, with that bit of preamble in the way, we've got the Silencer Volume 1, that's volume with a small v, called Code of Honor. It contains issues 1 to 6. The second volume you can see here is called Hell Ide Road. That contains issues 7 to 12 and then ends with Annual 1. And then volume 3, which is this one here, is called Up in Smoke and contains issues 13 to 18. Now, note that this is set just before Teen Titans 29. So if you're reading Teen Titans or if you're reading this at the same time and so on, just be aware this is set before Teen Titans 29, which is where Honor shows up in that series. Now, overall, this series has no real link to Dark Knight's Metal. It actually seems to be all about Leviathan. And in terms of Leviathan, it's basically about the Talia al Ghul network and the civil war within that network. And then at the end, it kind of hits into the Brian Michael Bendis Leviathan event and what happens there. Now, we're going to talk about that in section 8 of this guide, which is about Superman. But you don't need to know about any of that to read and understand Silencer. And to be honest, Silencer is highly recommended. It was loads of fun. It's a great series, great character. It's a shame it got cancelled, but I can see why it lasted a lot longer than most of these series, because it is just really good and I would recommend it. I'm thinking of actually getting this custom bound personally. Okay, with that, let's back up very slightly, and we're looking here at the Terrifics. So the Terrifics, if you see here, this is the Dark Knight's Metal stuff, and that's a picture of Tempest Fugonaut there from Sideways. But the Terrifics here, you'll notice, start a little bit later than all the others on this guide. And the reason for that is that the Terrifics issue 1 is actually set after the events of No Justice, which comes a little while after Dark Knight's Metal. So that's worth noting. Terrifics, even though it's from 2018 to 2020, starts after the events of No Justice, not just after the events of Dark Knight's Metal. But hey, let's have a look at the actual series itself. So it's written by Jeff Lemire, drawn by various artists, and the storyline's, well, pretty interesting or involved. Basically, Simon Stagg, bad guy, opens a portal to the Dark Multiverse, and that basically means that Mr. Terrific, Metamorpho, Plastic Man, and Phantom Girl join forces to escape the Dark Multiverse and end up kind of cosmically tied together to get ready to fight off another threat from the Dark Multiverse while using some of Simon Stagg's facilities as their base. And right at the start of the series, they come across a message from Tom Strong. I don't want to gloss over that, so let's have a quick moment to talk about who the fuck is Tom Strong. As a brief aside, we should probably talk about Tom Strong. So the notable thing about the series The Terrifics is that it brings Tom Strong, and therefore the first character from the ABC imprint, into the mainstream post-Flashpoint DC Comics universe. Immediately, there's a lot to unpack there. The first thing is, what is ABC? ABC is what the name was for an imprint on DC called America's Best Comics, which is often considered to have been pioneered by Alan Moore. But there's a bit more to it than that. America's Best Comics, or ABC, was a comic book publishing brand within, technically, Wildstorm. So back when Wildstorm was originally created and was owned by Jim Lee, there was an imprint in Wildstorm, which was when Alan Moore proposed this idea of America's Best Comics as an imprint to Wildstorm founder Jim Lee. At that point, Jim Lee didn't work for DC. He still worked for Image Comics. And at that point, America's Best Comics, ABC, became a thing. Now, Tom Strong is an American comic book series within America's Best Comics, written by Alan Moore, originally with art by Chris Sprouse, that was initially published every 2 months by America's Best Comics. Now, if you haven't heard of America's Best Comics, you may have heard of some of the other series within that, things like Top 10 and things like that, written by Alan Moore. ABC as a brand and as a sub-imprint went through a bit of a weird publishing journey, because when Jim Lee came over to DC and when Wildstorm was bought by DC, Alan Moore and DC have a very tempestuous relationship. So that was just generally a little bit difficult and strange. There's a lot you can read online about it. But long story short, the notable thing here is that Tom Strong, who's part of that ABC sub-brand universe, has now finally re-entered the chat in the DC Rebirth mainstream continuity. So we're back at the map, and what we have here is the 4 trade paperbacks that comprise The Terrifics. So Volume 1, volume with a small v, is just called Meet the Terrifics and contains issues 1 to 6. Remember, this is set after the events of No Justice. Volume 2 has got Tom Strong on the cover, as you can see there. Let me just zoom in a little bit. There. And it's actually called Tom Strong and the Terrifics. It contains issues 7 to 14. It's worth noting issue 10 references the Terrifics annual, but in the collected format, the annual issue is actually collected here in this volume, which is kind of annoying, but you'll deal with it. Like I say, this only collects issue 7 to 14, and then in issue 13 of this, basically there is a meeting between Phantom Girl and Plastic Man's son, Offspring, which is a bit weird, but again, the explanation for that is in annual 1, which is over here. It's just annoying and badly mapped. With that, let's have a look at the third volume. So volume with a small v3 is called The God Game. The writer changes, so it stops being Jeff Lemire and it moves over to Jean Luen Yang, who takes over as writer. It contains issues 15 to 18, and then Annual 1. It's not a great place to put Annual 1. Like I say, Annual 1 is referenced in both issues 10 and 13 over here, so this is kind of annoying. Issue 15, however, also references the event of Annual 1, and again, Annual 1 clearly predates the introduction of Offspring or Luke O'Brien, so the sequencing even within this trade paperback is stupid and annoying. Issue 18, which is the penultimate issue, which is before Annual 1 the way it's mapped here, that's branded Year of the Villain, The Offer, and The Offer is made to Bizarro, who's a character who has not been in the series up until this point. That takes us very neatly up to the 4th volume, which is the Terrifics Volume 4, The Tomorrow War. So what this contains is Terrifics 19, which is Dark Gifts, Terrific 20, Evil Unleashed, issue 21, which is Doom Rising, issue 22, which is Year of the Villain, Bizarro and the Terribles, issue 23, which continues the Bizarro arc, issue 24, where the Bizarro arc basically ends, and then after issue 24, it also includes issues 25 to 30. Now, just for the Type P readers amongst you, just for those of you who are being a bit obsessive about this, the events from issue 25 to 30 do occur in a paradoxical timeline of Prime Earth, which was born after Perpetua breaks hypertime in the aftermath of the Justice Doom War, and they eventually get merged back into the main continuity with the unknotting of the timeline and the events of Dark Knight's Death Metal. But essentially what I'm saying is half the issues in this are set somewhere between Year of the Villain and Dark Knight's Death Metal, but you don't need to think about that and you don't need to care, because that doesn't really make any material difference to a Type J reader. What else was I going to say? Issue 25 of this, which is the first one, which is after the Year of the Villain branding. That's kind of a weird choose-your-own-adventure issue. It's kind of hard to read. Then you have issue 26, issue 27. Issue 27 references the fact that Cyborg is away over in Justice League Odyssey. And then issue 28 to 30 is just the actual arc, The Tomorrow War, which this is named after. What's worth noting is issue 28 to 30, so the ones called The Tomorrow War, were never actually released in physical singles due to COVID, but they are in the trade paperback. And if you do read the Terrifics, what you will then find is they eventually, let me just zoom out, the events of the Terrifics do eventually continue over in Dark Knight's Death Metal. As a result, what you'll see here is if you go up to the strategic level, I've actually got the Terrifics line continuing a little bit past Year of the Villain, although in trade paperback version, you would really read that just here, and then I guess read Year of the Villain afterwards. But as I say, this is a Justice League event, not really related to the new age of DC heroes. Apologies, the Terrifics is slightly complicated or confusing there. It's both of those things. And where it's located and how it's situated, none of it really makes intuitive sense, which is why it's worth discussing in a fair bit more detail here. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's go to the very last series of the New Age of DC Heroes, which is this one, The Unexpected from 2018. It's an 8-issue series that's collected in a single trade paperback collection you can see here called Call of the Unknown. It's written by Steve Orlando, it's drawn by Carrie Nord, and it's about someone called Janet Fowles, who's also known as Firebrand, who's a former paramedic who's forced to feed something inside her heart called a conflict engine by starting a fight every 24 hours. If you've seen the Jason Statham movie Crank, it's basically that with weird mystical stuff going on. Now, I am conscious that technically issue 1 of this follows on from the introduction of one of the main characters, someone called Viking Judge, who's introduced in Supergirl 20. And Supergirl 20 actually ends with that character getting whisked away and appearing in issue 1 of this. But honestly, you can just ignore Supergirl 20, ignore the online guides and reading orders. You can just read the 8 issues of The Unexpected by itself without worrying about anything else. Other important things about The Unexpected, let's see. It's set very clearly after Batman and the Signal, because the Signal does feature in this. There is one use on one panel of the use of a carrier door, for those of you that are interested in the more Wildstorm related stuff. The main antagonist is someone called Mandrak, and if you know your DC, you'll know he's the Dark or Anti-Monitor, which theoretically makes this a universe-wide, global, epic super story, but it just isn't. And it also features Tempest Fuginaut, and again, Tempest Fuginaut we saw in Sideways here, and it is this character from the Dark Multiverse stories over in DC Dark Knight's Metal. Overall, all of the stuff about The Unexpected is kind of about like Nth Metal and the World Forge, blah, 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 blah. It's not very exciting. And it's pretty forgettable. I can see why it was cancelled. Right, so zooming out, this is the trade paperback view. This is where we are. We are done. That's it. New Age of DC Heroes. Done and dusted. Hopefully that was helpful. Hopefully that was useful. Remember, we have the trade paperback view here, but if you do just want something a bit more high level, we have the strategic level view of the map here. Thanks for watching. Next time we're going to be talking about Batman. Are you going to be there?
All right, thanks for watching, everybody. As always, please like, comment, subscribe. As always, please follow me on Twitter at @IamThomasJudge, where I will post a daily review of whatever comics I've been reading. You can get an idea of what I'm up to on the channel. And as always, please support the channel by heading over to Amazon.com and checking out my prose novel about superheroes. It's a completely original piece of work. The first episode in it is called Arrivals, and the series as a whole is called No Gods or Kings. You can find an excerpt of that on my website, nogodsorkings.com. Until next time, everybody, stay classy.